everyone. Welcome to the next edition of Watch and Resist as part of the web platform Read and Resist. Today, we're really excited. My co-host Fav and I were really kindly joined by Professor of Gender Studies Alison Phipps of the University of Sussex, soon to be Newcastle University, to discuss her book, Me Not You, The Trouble with Mainstream Feminism. So yeah, with that introduction out of the way, what we'll do is have a kind of brief introduction session where we introduce kind of what you're working on at the moment, maybe Alison, or that kind of thing. And then, yeah, we'll move on to some of our questions about the book. So first up, how are you feeling today?
Well, I'm feeling rather stressed because I'm trying to move house. As I've just been telling you, it's a nightmare. I wish everybody would stop moving. Can everybody please stop moving? Because I need to find somewhere to live. But other than that, it's lovely. It's lovely to do this. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. This is a public call though for everyone. Please seriously stop moving. We need to
just stop it. Exactly, stop it.
Fab, how are you doing today?
I'm all right, actually. I'm okay. It's lovely to be here and to chat about this book. I think everyone should read it.
Oh,
but yeah, otherwise I'm all right. Yeah, I know.
Also, I don't think the inside gets enough praise, you know. So when you take this beautiful cover off, this gorge bit of black and pink,
it's nice, isn't it?
Nice, very stylish. Yeah. I took it out this week at the hairdressers recently, like full disclosure. I was like, I hadn't noticed that this was different. I was like, I feel like I'm going on a night. It's kind of day to night, you know, it's lovely.
Yeah. Day to night. I love that. That's brilliant.
Okay, so maybe if we talk a little bit then about the sort of overview of the book and maybe the core themes of it. So there's a lot in there, a lot of richness, and you draw that together so beautifully throughout the whole piece. But can you maybe, for some of the readers that haven't got the book yet or are waiting to read it, can you provide an overview of it and some of the themes or your beliefs that underpin that?
Yeah, I can. It's funny because I did cram a lot in. It was sort of like a massive, brain dump of everything that I was thinking and feeling. So it is quite hard to summarize it. And that sounds really annoying. It's like some academic saying, my work is so complex, I can't possibly summarize it in, 200 pages, or I can't possibly fit that into 6,000 words for a journal article. But you know what I mean? I just bunged a lot in. I mean, essentially, it's about the violence that we can do in fighting sexual violence. And by we, I mean white women, white feminism mostly, which of course is not just enacted by white women, but it is a kind of white and bourgeois dominated movement. And I call that mainstream feminism in the book. It's sometimes called white feminism, especially what I look at is the attachment to carceral systems in mainstream feminism. And also then I move into how mainstream white feminism can quite easily get reactionary. So the continuities between feminism in the mainstream and trans and sex worker exclusionary forms. And I kind of link that through this concept of political whiteness, which I'm actually not quite sure about now. But when I wrote it at the time, it seemed like a good idea because I was kind of noticing all these different commonalities between different forms of politics dominated by bourgeois white people. And the three key characteristics in mainstream feminism is a kind of a narcissism, which is around centering the experiences of women who look like me, a kind of alertness to threats, so a focus on threat and victimization rather than resistance and building alternatives, and then a kind of will to power, which in white women's case is exercised by proxy, often through calling on the punitive state or the institution. And I guess the overall argument is that in the mainstream, feminism doesn't just center white women. We've kind of talked about that before, but it also treats more marginalized groups as disposable because it legitimates that carceral system that harms Black and other marginalized people. And also it calls for bad men to be expelled from elite industries and institutions, And the question I have about that is, where do they go? So I'm kind of in full agreement that losing your job is, you know, a perfectly legitimate consequence for perpetrating abuse. But where do we send those men? It's almost like we're outsourcing them to other women. And then, of course, in the more reactionary forms, trans and sex worker exclusionary feminism, the dynamics get quite extreme. So the narcissism becomes kind of, my victimization is the most important thing. So therefore, I will treat all other liberation movements as a threat to me. And if you criticize me, you're denying my victimhood. So it's a very threatened position. It's a very defensive position. It doesn't just treat more marginalized people as disposable. It treats them as the enemy if they disagree or if they get in the way. And then the will to power in those movements can be quite vicious. I mean, trans exclusionary feminism in particular has got really vicious, and it almost looks like Gamergate now, doesn't it, online? And they've made alliances with the far right, you know, which are endangering us all. So I don't know whether you want to kind of pause there. I haven't talked about my core beliefs and principles, but I've just blathered on for quite a while.
No, that's great. Honestly, I mean, it's your book, but you're tying this all together so well. And it's definitely, I mean, Fabian and I have spoken about this a few times this week especially. Yeah, you tie them all together, all these themes together so well. Do you want to come in first?
No, yeah. I found it, you know, because I found it so instructive to kind of just see how mainstream and radical feminism is linked, and it, because we've been trying for some time now to make sense of where this has come from. And you also say it's not a new thing, and you really you show us where the roots are of this, and I found that really instructive. That it's not just free floating, it hasn't just come from nowhere. Also historically. So linking mainstream feminism and then also radical feminism to kind of this kind of matriarchy, these reformers who were trying to instruct and correct women. I thought that was really instructive.
Yeah, I mean, the history of white womanhood, you know, we don't pay enough attention to that, do we, when we're looking at white feminism? I mean, I've just actually been listening to an amazing podcast called White Picket Fence, which is about the history of white womanhood and white women in white supremacy. It's kind of based in the US, but it's relevant to us as well here. And I know Jessie Daniels has got a book coming out soon, which I'm so excited for, which is called Nice White Ladies, you know, which is going to be brilliant because she's just brilliant. But yeah, I think the links are so clear, and the kind of threads that go back in time, but also the threads that kind of come together in the present. So I think the book sort of emerged from Brexit, Black Lives Matter, and Me Too for me, because all of those things kind of happened, not Black Lives Matter in general, but there was a kind of resurgence of Black Lives Matter protests around that time. And I think all of those things kind of were sitting together in my head. Obviously, Brexit happened first, then Trump, and then Me Too that was just before Trump, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And in particular, I was starting to see some of the kind of links between the Brexit politics and white feminism, and thinking, you know, I mean, it sounds really basic, doesn't it? But thinking that, you know, these are things that are common. And I think that's why I use the term political whiteness. I'm not sure whether I'll continue to use that, because I'm not sure how helpful it is. I think it might run the risk of slipping into the kind of whiteness studies, you know, white self-analysis, you know, Robin DiAngelo type stuff, which I'm really not interested in at all. But at the time, it sort of made sense to me to sort of say, you know, if we're going to take race seriously within feminism, then we have to acknowledge that there are continuities between, you know, forms of politics that are dominated by white people, even between those that consider themselves progressive and those that we would call reactionary.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing I did want to pick up on what you were saying before, and obviously it comes through in the book, for me, is the synergy between you're talking about the bad men of Hollywood, and this notion of, I think it reminds us, I think, a little bit of Miriam Carver's new book, about the distinction she makes. I can't remember what term she uses between them, but between consequences and sort of consequences being losing your job if you're doing something at work, for example, in that context. And then the difference between that and cancel
and punishment. So
how those sort of interactions are imbued with carcerality and then also racism and the kind of intersecting oppressions. I'm interested in how you draw that out in the book a little bit. If you could speak about that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think not just carcerality, but sort of disposability as well, because I think one of the principles that I hold very dear is that no one is disposable. Even the people we really, really hate, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't suffer consequences for their actions, and they shouldn't, I mean, you can't, I really like Mia Mingus's kind of insight as well, that you can't, or is it Mariam Carver? I don't know. Is it? So you can't hold somebody accountable, they have to hold themselves accountable, but you can kind of create consequences. But I do really feel strongly that in the society we would want to live in, nobody would be disposable. And yes, so Mariam says a consequence is losing your job, a punishment is never being able to work again. And so if we think that through, if we are getting rid of these bad men from Hollywood or from academia or whatever, but we're saying that that's a consequence rather than a punishment. So we're not saying they should never be able to work again, they should never be able to feed themselves or their families, then where do they go? Because they're going to have to make a living somewhere, unless we want them to be on the streets, which I presume we don't want anybody to have to be on the streets. And that was kind of what led me to sort of think about this as a sort of outsourcing. I think it's outsourcing. I mean, in generous terms, it's outsourcing. I think sometimes it can even approach NIMBYism, you know, like we don't want these men and we don't really care where they go next. And I don't think there's an easy answer, because of course, we shouldn't have to have abusers in our workplaces just to avoid putting them onto somebody else. It's a systemic problem. But I wish that as feminists, we would acknowledge and try to think through and work through those systemic problems at the same time as trying to hold people accountable. I guess it's going to the next step and the next step. And I'm always thinking, and then what? And then what?
Yeah,
you know?
I feel that. For me, it's a little bit looking at when those kind of those problems are individualized, and they're not, we're not then looking at the structural root that's causing, for example, sexual violence, which those roots are deep. So if we're getting rid of that individual, okay, this problem is seemingly solved for however long might in a short period, but what then are we doing as an intervention to meaningfully like intervene in that person's behavior or people, or how is that because it seems like it kind of stops, like people are quite happy. You know, I'm thinking about, this is slightly different, but you know, Matt Hancock obviously resigned however long ago for whatever he did. Now, for me, people were celebrating that, right? We see it so often. You pick this out in the book anyway, but this kind of celebration of like very quick solution to a very, you know, a structural problem. And then people kind of get on with their lives essentially, but there's no intervention. So what happened? You know, we continually have this then repeated, right?
Exactly. And that's how the system maintains itself, actually. So sometimes it's more harmful. You know, I call it institutional airbrushing. You kind of remove the blemish, and then, you know, everything's shiny and new again, but the sickness underneath remains, and then everybody moves on. So I think there's also a strategic question around, you know, do we really want to participate in those types of interventions? And for me, there is also a kind of way in which we operate, especially, I mean, I know universities, that's what I know the best, and there's a way in which we operate in kind of not addressing bad behavior when it occurs, letting it get out of hand, then calling the manager and saying, get rid of that person. And in that, we're sort of operating as clients of the system, really. rather than as part of a community. And I'm not saying it's up to the survivor to challenge, or somebody that's being victimized by somebody to challenge, but if we think we are a community, then we need to behave like one. And at the moment, we're not really behaving like one, we're behaving like clients of the system.
Yeah. No, you're right in that sense. And also that the go-to is always a punitive response.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, actually, the person who has done the harm stays in the post, and the person who's survived it gets moved.
Yes.
That's the only way the system can work within that. And we see it also in terms of students as well, that system about having actually a criminal, like legal approach, kind of sort of copied within the university system, but where it's more of a civil kind of balance of probabilities, but actually which is very formalized and has some serious consequences for all parties. And not the least, the actual person who was harmed has to be re-traumatized, go through that process. So you're right. And it's then thinking about what does community then mean in that sense? What can we do?
Yeah. Exactly. And we're not one, are we? I mean, that's part of the problem in higher education. We've been so individualized and alienated, and we're also stressed, that it's very difficult. And I did a talk a little while ago, and somebody asked a very, very valid question, which is, why do you want to put more work onto everybody? Which, is a very valid question. But I just don't see an alternative, really, if we want to intervene in some of these behaviors, especially the behaviors at the less kind of at the more everyday end of things. And often what happens in those types of situations as well is that the person that is on the receiving end of the behaviors doesn't really want a punishment. They just want the person doing it to stop doing it. Yeah. Stop being such an arse, that's all we want, but the system can only deny or escalate. Yeah. So you've either got nothing, or you've got an incredibly kind of onerous, traumatic, punitive process, which, as you said, doesn't change the behavior. I mean, even if somebody does lose their job, they go away. I mean, there was a case at my own institution where somebody lost their job, went away, became really angry, and continued to date much younger women, and probably continue the same behavior. So it doesn't really work, does it, on any level?
Right. So one thing I did want to pick up on what you were just saying, is this idea that institutions, if we're speaking about the academy, which is probably what we all know best at this point, how conflict is not seen as an opening often. You're talking about this kind of nothingness response because they're too scared of having this blemish appear, as you talk about the book. So it's the main thing is about thinking, how do we push this aside? How do we silence, rather than how do we see this conflict as an opening for us as an institution to think about, okay, how do we ensure that we contribute to harm prevention, or how do we think about how we might inform our employees of a better way of dealing with harm too, and how do we learn in that process, because we don't know everything, but it's that kind of facade that they have to maintain. It's quite interesting to me that it's not seen like that. It's not seen as not a positive thing, but as something to be learned from, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I don't know, I mean, I think it's quite human, isn't it, in some ways, to be scared of conflict. But I also think there is something about the setup of these institutions which means that, it becomes even more difficult. And, there's not just the individualization, the alienation, the kind of lack of trust between different parts of the institution, but there's also the sort of focus on reputation management, which means that when something happens, the kind of potential impact of that on the value of the institution is more of a problem than what's actually happened. And that's the system. Obviously universities themselves are within a broader system, and I'm not saying there's not room to do things differently. There is, because different institutions are different and there are choices being made by the people running these institutions. But there is also an overarching system which our government bodies like Universities UK, the Office for Students, have to take responsibility for, that has made higher education extremely toxic.
Yeah, I mean, you only have to look at the moment if we think about University of Liverpool and what is happening there.
Exactly. Or what happened in COVID, with the students, forced to come back to university because they wanted the fees and the rents from them, then locked in their halls of residence, told they couldn't leave, at one point told they couldn't go home, and then we had cops on campus at Sussex, keeping them in their dormitories and roughing up the students. I think it was mostly Black students, unsurprisingly, that kind of dared to come out. So I think that was a real wake-up call, I think, for people who didn't already understand exactly what the institution is, to understand what the institution is. And that's the problem, isn't it? The institution is the master's house. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to get things from the institution, but the institution does not love us. The institution will not protect us. And if it does protect some of us, it will protect some of us at the expense of others. So I think it's also about, and I think maybe especially with the university, because we have had this very kind of idealistic kind of notion of what the university is, which I don't think it's ever been, actually, if you look at the roots of, universities in enclosure and slavery. But we have laboured under this idea that the neoliberal university is somehow an aberration, when it's not. It's a continuity of what came before, and it's the master's house. And I think white feminists, because we feel relatively comfortable in that house most of the time, because it feels like it sort of fits us, we look to it for protection, and we are surprised and shocked and outraged when we don't get it, but we haven't spent the time thinking of alternatives because we've been too busy putting our faith in the system, with the result that we've nothing left to do but complain to the manager. That's the situation as I see it anyway.
That's just really important. Sorry,
No. And we're completely oblivious to what harm it causes to those in marginalized groups.
Exactly.
At all levels in the institution.
Yeah. No,
and then everyone is shocked why at the top these marginalized groups aren't represented.
Exactly. I mean, you can't use the system against itself. You can't use the right hand of patriarchy against the left. I mean, and white feminists do that to a certain extent, and we get a certain way by doing that. We've got a certain way forward by kind of working within the system and using parts of the system against other parts of the system, but we'll never be liberated by that. And we have also done that at the expense of a whole load of marginalized people.
Right. And we see that replicated for sure with the criminal legal system and that use, because there's similar systems in that sense.
Exactly.
I think there's kind of links. We might go back to some of the other kind of, questions that we have later on, but I'm wanting to think about this notion of power within the system with what you've just said. So, mainstream feminisms, I guess, I mean, you identify this for sure, but we see it playing out, especially now on social media and kind of, in lots of different outlets, how they seek power within the system rather than thinking, forget that system, let's smash that system up, we're gonna do things better outside of that system. So we wanted to think about this maybe within the context of Sarah Everard's case, and how certain feminist groups during this time have used this as a moment to further entrench our kind of attachments to carceral systems, rather than thinking the police, they're not here to serve, protect any of us, but particularly marginalized communities and our marginalized siblings, right? So we need to show up for them rather than, using the systems that make their lives unlivable. How do you think about that within the context of the book?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I kind of, I was quite disappointed by the Sarah Everard response, and maybe I shouldn't have been. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but it did feel like there was some awareness kind of starting to spread. And, then all these white feminists who've been saying Black Lives Matter were kind of asking for misogyny to be a hate crime and, for street harassment to be criminalized. I mean, thank goodness for Sisters Uncut, right? Because otherwise the whole thing would have been a massive mess. And I was really kind of struck by that. After a woman was raped and murdered by a cop, they're still asking for more power to the police. I mean, I think attachment here is crucial. And while I don't want the book to be a kind of work of white self-analysis and sort of cod psychology, I think we do need to explore the nature of these attachments that white feminists have to the system, and not just because of the benefits the system has for us, but also because we're encouraged to see ourselves as constantly under sexual threat and to look to the carceral system to protect us. So it's kind of a version of what Susan Griffin called the patriarchal protection racket, which is where it's the threat of stranger rape that makes you look to your husband for protection when he's actually more likely to abuse you. I think this racket primarily targets bourgeois white women, and it's not just about preserving patriarchy, it's about preserving white supremacy as well. So it's the pretext of protecting white women that constructs communities, cultures, nations as violent. It justifies colonization, borders, other military industrial projects, and disposal of unwanted populations into the carceral system. And that spectre of sexual danger kind of constructs particular people as a threat, queer and trans people as well. So the acts and threats that keep us afraid, the acts and threats of sexual violence that keep us afraid and that make us kind of docile subjects of capitalism by seeking the protection of men and kind of modifying our behavior and not going out, also drive us into the arms of the carceral and colonial state. And then that enables all these other kinds of violence in the service of capitalist accumulation. And I think that's something that white feminism hasn't really reckoned with and hasn't really understood, because we're so kind of focused on our own protection. And I understand that, there's a lot of horrible experiences around the table. And it's very difficult to kind of say to somebody that's had a horrendous experience, we also need to think about, at what cost does our protection come? But I do think it's something that white feminism as a whole needs to start reckoning with. So I think that's where the attachment comes, to the carceral system. It's that we think that it's the only way to keep ourselves safe.
I think this ties in what you were saying in the book as well, about this notion that we are everywhere. So whiteness is everywhere. And so because we're always at the center of those kind of discussions and discourses, it kind of, it's sort of, I don't know, it's a privilege at the same time, because we are, we're not actually thinking about how our own actions in kind of, I don't know, getting justice or accountability or whatever it is at that time in response to harm, how that then impacts on, other communities that may not have that same privilege, and how then discourse is defined by our own sort of engagements with that.
And how you write about it in the book as well, how we're always produced as innocent, and how everything is always, the victim is framed around innocence, and how the impact then, and that links in with what Flick was saying, how other marginalized groups are just always the other.
Yes.
Threat, or especially how black women are produced as already historically, and also through slavery, as already sexualized, and so whereas the white women have to be protected from that, other groups are then subject to that.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that despite the fact that, lots of white feminists talk about intersectionality, despite the fact that we say Black Lives Matter, I think that in mainstream white feminism, woman is still white. And I think that was really clear in the response to the Sarah Everard kind of case. I don't think for a minute that any of these white feminists thought, I'm going to put more marginalized people at risk and I don't care. It's kind of like an amnesia that happens when white feminists feel under threat, and we run into the arms of the thing that we think is going to save us, even though it doesn't actually save us. And we kind of maybe willfully forget, about the fact that it's not safe for a lot of other people. I think there's also a kind of splitting that goes on, as you were saying, between victim good, perpetrator bad, the frame, which not only kind of justifies treating people as disposable, but it also means that we kind of validate only a particular type of victim as well. And it also means that we don't acknowledge the ways that we perpetrate harm. And I'm not suggesting that we've all sexually assaulted people, but we are, you know, we are both victims and oppressors at the same time. And that's something that white people seem to find really difficult to deal with, you know, and that's, I think, at the heart of defensiveness over, you know, discussion of whiteness or white supremacy or white fragility or critical race theory, this idea that, well, I can't be racist because that means I'm a bad person. You know, I can't have privilege because my life is shit, you know, and not able to think intersectionally about the fact that we can have, you know, advantages in some areas and disadvantages in others, and not able to think about the fact that we may have been horrifically badly harmed in our lives, but that doesn't mean we're not also perpetrating harms, either structurally or on the everyday level. You know, so it's, and I think that's something that, you know, for kind of very good reasons, more marginalized people don't seem to find so difficult. You know, that idea that you're either a victim or a perpetrator and you can never be both.
I really appreciate your framing actually of that in the book as well. So this idea that, yeah, they're not mutually exclusive, the victimhood and sort of white supremacist discourse or practices. So yeah, and how, yeah, in terms of what you're saying in terms of intersectionality, so part of my thesis is, you know, it's underpinned by this intersectional kind of this methodology that I'm using, and for me what's been really important is this embrace of complexity at many different levels, and how you're saying, you know, we all occupy different social locations and have different experiences and shared experiences too, but it's about leaning into that rather than trying to sort of say binary, as you say, it's that example of how the criminal legal system works. So you've got bad person did bad thing, therefore has punishment, and then good person is, you know, saintly, and kind of you never then embrace that complexity, because capitalism, these capitalist, you know, discourses and systems are too preoccupied with having the one size fits all approach, which doesn't work for anyone actually. So
no, it doesn't. And it also means if you're not saintly, then you don't get justice as well. So, you know, it really, everybody loses from that, don't they?
Even if you are saintly, I'm thinking about some experiences that we've had, like if I'm, you know, supported people in the past through the court process, so how, especially in kind of cases involving sexual violence, so how often those who go through that process are left feeling kind of deflated and not supported, because they haven't got accountability, because at no point has anyone asked them, what does accountability mean for you, what does harm mean to you, what is it that you actually would like to see out of this situation, rather than saying, imposing system onto you and your experience.
Exactly. And punishment doesn't change behavior, does it? You know, I mean, we know this, I know this as a parent, you know, it doesn't change behavior, and if anything, it can make it worse. You know, so yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the interesting thing as well though is that white feminists do find it so difficult to engage with that, and it's like if you're engaging with this complexity, it's as if you're denying somebody's victimhood. You know, and it's not about that. It's, you know, it's horrible things happen to privileged white women all the time, and it's horrible and it should never happen, and they deserve all the support that they can get. But it's very interesting to me, that defensiveness. I mean, that's something I've had a lot of from trans exclusionary feminists, that I'm saying that white women who are raped should just shut up about it, which is not what I'm saying at all. You know, I'm saying we just need to see our experiences, and maybe we don't need to see that when we're kind of right in the middle of our experiences, but the movement in general needs to see these experiences in the context of a much broader system, and explore what they do, and link that, as you said, to the history of how white women and the wounding of white women, whether real or imagined, has been part of these systems almost since their inception.
I agree with that. I saw something recently actually on Twitter, and it really kind of, it was what you've just mentioned briefly, this idea that, you know, when you're in the midst of that kind of situation, you don't necessarily want to be thinking about abolition or kind of you know that any of those things. But yeah, someone kind of spoke about that, and they said, yeah, like, this experience happened to me, I was harmed severely at the time, I wanted them in prison, like I wanted them to pay for what they'd done, but I am an abolitionist, and I knew at the time as well that I also didn't want them to be disposed of. So it's kind of that they, you know, their own politic informed that, but it's that, again, that's complexity in itself. You say kind of how there's also, thinking out loud, there's this kind of, I think, from trans exclusionary radical, however you want to call them, there's this constant wanting of monopoly on suffering, I think, sometimes. And definitely. It comes through, like, so my research into, I look at how incarcerated trans women are constructed within the penal context, and how these different discourses from the sort of personal to the institutional level shape that. And obviously a big part of that is the mass amounts of you know, tweets and whatever on social media, which kind of, you know, speaks to your outrage economy in the book, of constantly this use of false statistics or anything else that they can muster in order to keep attached to this notion of suffering. It's so dangerous for and also frustrating, obviously, but dangerous for those people directly impacted.
It is, it's so dangerous, and it also doesn't get us anywhere. It's kind of, you know, I drew recently for a talk this circuit of mainstream feminism, which is disclosure, outrage, airbrushing, reset, and then it starts again. So, you know, we're feeding this machine, you know, I mean, the system runs on outrage, the corporate media runs on outrage now, the far right runs on outrage. But this kind of monetization of outrage doesn't imply any care for survivors or any desire to reduce harm. I mean, if these trans exclusionary radical feminists think that these far right men who are now kind of fighting their corner give a flying fuck, am I allowed to swear?
We encourage it. We encourage it, Alison. Great.
Well, if they think that these men give a flying fuck about, you know, violence against women, then they really haven't been paying any attention. I mean, the other thing about outrage is that it only gets us so far. I mean, it can be really useful, can't it, in putting things on the table, but at some point you have to move from outrage to building something different, building alternatives. And then, of course, you know, as we've already discussed, the outrage about individuals can distract us from the systems that enable them, because the outrage more often produces kind of airbrushing than anything else. So, you know, I think I only started to see that really clearly. I mean, I'd been seeing that happen in universities for a while with the sort of naming and shaming of bad men, but I saw that really clearly when Me Too, or the viral version of Me Too kind of started this circuit going. And, you know, and I think if you do look, there have been a lot of achievements, you know, I'm not denying that at all, but I think if you look at the level of systemic change that's happened as a result of Me Too, you would probably find that there's very little. You know, and I think that's because the circuit reproduces itself, and it reproduces these systems.
No, I think that's key, isn't it? That I think that's sort of also what I got as the key message from the book, because if as feminism is a social movement, then we should be thinking about, you know, really kind of attacking the systemic inequalities that produce this kind of, and these kind of systems that are, you know, that are deeply harmful. And I think that's what's key, isn't it? That leads then to building. And I think that was one of the things that I took away from this book, and that's why I thought that's why it needs to be read, because we can't constantly focus on the interpersonal, because that's what the system wants as well, because that can then produce this divide and rule, doesn't it?
Of course, yeah, of course. And white women have been a key kind of object of divide and rule, instrument of divide and rule, you know, and we don't recognize that enough. No, that's right.
We talk about the we a little bit then. So I find this really interesting when we talk. I get a lot from Miriam Carr, but I know we all get a lot from Miriam Carr's framing of stuff, because she's just so great.
I just love her.
But thinking about how we are all kind of sort of party to these systems, and it's an everyday kind of I guess battle to kind of ensure that we're not perpetuating, you know, harms under the kind of caste system, the capitalist system, all of these different interlocking systems. So we wanted to talk about your positionality section, which has been so helpful for my own positionality framing in my thesis, because it's quite hard as a process, and I think Fab kind of it's hard because it is personal to do these sort of sections and to think about that in the real time, and you see, I mean, I'm sure I see good positionality kind of sections, and some that I think are quite performative, whereas with this book I found it really heartening actually, that I found it quite raw, and this idea that you're conscious of in your framing and the whole book that you're conscious that you're not trying to absolve yourself of these systems of whiteness and white supremacy. So yeah, I wanted to kind of ask you how you try and maintain that in the everyday. And I'm not saying it's perfect by any step of the imagination, but I think it'd be quite helpful, because it's important that we're also consistently aware of the kind of practices that we embody and put on to others as well. So yeah,
I mean, I'm not really sure how to answer. I don't really have a particularly profound answer to this. Okay. And also I don't by any means want to position myself as a kind of paragon of doing this right, because I'm sure I don't. And I also kind of am very aware of not wanting to, just take up space with my own reflections on my own positionality. I mean, you said there are bad positionality statements and good ones, and some of them are not just performative, but they're also like me. It's kind of, that just replicates the narcissism, doesn't it? And you just think, I don't want to read your fucking autobiography. Do you know what I mean? So I'm kind of, I'll give it I think one of the things that I've found, both my Achilles heel and maybe a kind of advantage, is that I'm never sure of myself. I'm very self-critical, and I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but it does have its advantages, because I do kind of reflect on my interactions with people a lot, and I give myself a bit of a hard time, about all kinds of things. I'm not sure I would recommend that as a strategy. But maybe if you can do it together with a supportive friend, then it's okay. I mean, something I found really useful is Marilyn Frye's phrase, disloyalty to whiteness, which is in her book, The Politics of Reality. And for me, that means, for white feminists, it means kind of not just being aware of ourselves in everyday interactions, but also on a political level, refusing to merely aspire to what white men have. So refusing to kind of go for what Nancy Fraser and Titha Bhattacharya call equal opportunity domination, but also refusing protection from white men if that harms more marginalized people, and divesting from that whole rotten system, which means recognizing that these institutions we put our hopes in are inherently violent, whether that's criminal punishment or whether that's the university, and kind of working to dismantle those systems, rather than using one hand of patriarchy against the other, or one hand of white supremacy against the other. So for me, I think it's more of a political question. I think personal self-reflection is really good, but I think that when that tips into sort of, that's the only thing you do, that's really bad. And guilt is never good, and it just takes up space. I think for me, it's more about sort of thinking about solidarity and thinking about comradeship and not being an ally. I really don't like that word. It's kind of, we're all in this together, actually. And these systems, they put us all in the shit, don't they? Some of us more than others. but they are hurting everyone. And I think that goes for all of us, actually. I mean, even if we're non-white, we may have certain privileges that we need to reflect on. You know, we have power or influence or even room for maneuver within a system, and try to use that to make things better. So something I do very much now, because I'm a professor, you know, I've got job security, I've got a certain amount of kind of clout institutionally. I always try to think about, well, how can I use that to sort of make things better in the institution? If I need to be saying things in meetings, and I'm doing that, especially now I'm leaving Sussex, saying things in meetings that other people wish they could say and can't say, then that's what I will do. You know, or if I need to be setting aside some of my time to kind of work through some of these difficult issues, then that's what I'll do. So I think, yeah, for me, it's kind of practical and political, and the self-reflection kind of comes after or as part of that. But it's self-reflection is not enough, and I think there is a real risk and a real tendency that white anti-racism just becomes self-reflection. And that's really dangerous.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also, I'm just thinking about the sort of the work on solidarity that does really speak to the core tenets of that. So this idea of self-reflection, action in concert, and effective modes of solidarity. So feeling with the other, and so that does make sense for a kind of okay, that's really helpful, actually. Great.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
I also found that distinction between ally and comradeship really helpful, because I've always tried to shy away from kind of like thinking, okay, well, maybe comrade is too much, because but if you're a comrade where you're aware of, you know, that you don't step into the limelight, you don't speak for others, but you actually get to amplify and to shore up and to support, then it makes a lot more sense, rather than being an ally, which can just be tokenistic and you show that in your book. And I thought that was really helpful. And then that comes to that kind of foundation around solidarity, because if we're in it together, but everybody is experiencing it differently and also has, you know, then you can also use your, maybe where you have a bit more leverage in that forum to speak up and to, rather than, and I like this, what Adrienne Marie Brown was saying, and also Nora Samaran, these notions that we don't leave it up to those people who are fighting to survive, to also be the ones who have to educate everyone and have to raise these issues, because that's, you know, that's impossible. It's an impossible burden.
I mean, I think sometimes we also place a bit too much focus on experience and the kind of primacy of experience, because I think experience is really important, but I think we also need to put those experiences into a frame. And I suppose that's what I was trying to do in the book. I was speaking about something I had experience of, white supremacy, white feminism, and trying to put that in a kind of systemic frame. At no point did I purport to speak for women of color or Black women, but this is my contribution to understanding that system that oppresses it all, of course drawing heavily on the work of Black feminists as well. But I think we can sometimes get too kind of stuck in, it's all about sharing experience, and some people's experience is more important than others, and we have to kind of step aside and let people talk about their experience, which we do, but we also have to work together and develop a collective analysis of the systems in which we live and how we might dismantle those systems in which we live and how we might work towards something better. And I think that, you know, we keep talking about Mariam Carver, but it's because she's so brilliant. And what she says is that not enough of us are doing that. You know, this is a collective project, and some people at the moment are being asked for all the answers, you know, and everybody else is sort of either not caring or saying, what do we do? And actually it needs to be a conversation. And I think sometimes white people can be scared of contributing to that conversation because we don't want to speak over people who've maybe had experiences of marginality that we don't have. But I think that we all need to be involved in thinking kind of how do these systems position us, and how do we how do we kind of work against them? I mean, the other thing about ally as well is that it can become an identity, can't it?
Yeah.
And then it gets wielded, you know, somebody defines themselves as an ally, a trans ally or whatever, and then when they get critiqued, they say, I'm an ally, you know, and you think, well, what does that mean? You know, I mean, ally should be a verb. If you're going to say ally, then use it in the verb. Is that a verb? Yes, it's a doing word, isn't it? To ally with, yeah. So you know, that reminds me of that Massive Attack song, Teardrop. Love is a verb, love is a doing word. Well, if you're gonna say ally, then use it as a verb. And if you're not doing it, then don't call yourself it.
Yeah.
You know, you can't just say I am one and then don't do anything else. So I much prefer comrade, and I know what you mean. Sometimes comrade sounds a bit too much, either, you know, in terms of kind of saying we're all the same, but we don't have to be.
No, but I think it's really helpful. I think it's great because it also the relationship is in the word.
Yes,
it's already relational.
It is.
We may make mistakes, and we'll probably make a lot of mistakes, but the point is, if then in terms of solidarity and we have trust and we build these relationships, then people can turn around and go, well, you know what, that was really not on, and then you can make amends, and you can try and learn, and
or I don't agree with you, actually, I think we should do this, or you know, or what have you. I mean, I think it's building those relationships, isn't it?
And one other point that I wanted to say is also then using, because again, linking that back to the institution, about how the institution co-opts and uses then potentially these kind of issues, like for instance equality and diversity and inclusion, and how decolonization is now being institutionalized. And then just rebadged and actually used within this capitalist system to, in essence, a tick box exercise. So it absolves the institution, doesn't it? And then again absolves us, because then we can just say, oh well, we've named 5 non-white, non-Western authors, so we're all right. We tick that box.
Exactly. And, you know, I mean, I'm not an expert on decolonization at all. I would never want to put myself forward as that. I try to work towards that in my teaching. But, you know, one of the things I think about with that is it's not about representation. It's about the very frameworks that underpin your work, isn't it? And when I teach gender studies, I start with intersectionality, and I start with the coloniality of gender, you know, so you kind of, it doesn't matter how many non-white authors you include, if you're not analyzing gender as, you know, at least partly, if not kind of almost fully, a colonial product, then you're not doing decolonization as far as I understand it. And I mean, I find Sarah Ahmed's work really helpful on all of this as well. Her stuff about kind of non-performativity, these institutional actions that pretend to be doing something, but actually they enable the institution not to do anything, like producing a report on racism, and then there's some racism, and you say, well, we've got this report, you know. And also she talks about institutional polishing, which kind of mixes in quite well with the idea of institutional airbrushing. So the idea of equality and diversity issues as a way to shine up the institution, equality and diversity work, as a way to shine up the institution. And you've got this shiny institution which is doing okay in the league tables, and then something happens and you're like, oh no, we've got a blemish, and then you have to brush it out. So I find that really useful. But also that goes back to the question of what the university is, doesn't it? And I think just as we're so attached to the carceral system as white feminists, we're so attached to the institution. We're so attached to the university. We want it to love us, we want it to embrace us and nurture us, and it's not going to do that. You know, it doesn't mean we shouldn't kind of take it for everything it's worth, but we have to find ways of supporting each other and being comrades to each other, you know. And we have to fight for the time and the space to do that. I think that's one of the big fights, isn't it? You know, for us in higher education.
I agree.
So but anyway, so you know, as you've already said, the book is in the book you ask us to take a hard look at ourselves, and you do end on a very positive note, giving us kind of some ways we can do that with the different questions that you ask. And it's all about looking to a progressive and transformative change. So how can we imagine alternative futures? And this is something that we're both also very, very keen and interested in. And what we find really inspiring is that you draw on, you've already said, you draw on Black feminist writings and activism. And for those who have influenced and challenged you, especially Mariam Kaba. And so for people who are listening to this and who may not be familiar with their work, what do you take as their most important messages in informing our collective pathways forward?
Okay, that's a really nice question. I mean, yeah, the book is very heavily reliant on Black feminism, especially, and other feminisms of colour. And I'm actually donating all of the royalties to projects by and for Black women as well, focused on sexual violence, because I felt very odd about kind of making money off of this work. And the other thing I would say is, I hope people do read my book, but, really it's based on the work of people who are a lot more cleverer than me. So go and read their work. So Mariam Kaba, Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Maria Lugones as well, who has really influenced me, Gargi Bhattacharya, Tithi Bhattacharya, all of these amazing thinkers. I mean, I think the key messages I've taken from Mariam's work and the work of other Black feminists is, first of all, nobody is disposable. And I think that, when you are writing from a positionality of a community that has been extremely disposable, it's easy to see how that becomes something which is central to your work. And that is something that I think we really need to take on board, because we don't see ourselves as potentially disposable very often. And I think that's why we're able to engage with kind of disposability in often quite glib ways. We don't really think it through. So nobody is disposable, even the people we hate, because if somebody is disposable, that potentially means everybody is disposable. And I think COVID has really taught us that, hasn't it? And I do hope there has been a little bit of consciousness raising from this awful time that we've been through. So that's the first principle that I kind of really take forward. The second one is that I want to end the violence. I want to end the harm. I don't just want to get kind of punishment of a few bad men, or support and justice for a few white women. I mean, I'd love those women to have justice, but I want us all to have justice, and I want the violence to stop. So when Angela Davis says we can't end violence by doing more violence, that's absolutely right. And that violence, and I think the other thing that Black feminism has is a very kind of expansive definition of violence, which includes state violence, economic violence, colonial violence, as well as interpersonal violence, and the connections between them. I think the other thing I take from this work is a kind of optimism about people being able to change, and people can change, and it is very difficult, but I think in some ways that's a choice, isn't it? And Mariam Kaba says hope is a discipline, and I think that's absolutely right, because you have to either choose to believe that people can change and that people at heart are not bad, or you choose to believe that some people at least are inherently bad, and that's a very depressing road to go down. So that's the other thing I kind of take from it, that people can change. It's very difficult sometimes, especially when people are in horrendous situations, or when people have built up these behaviors kind of over time, and these ways of being in the world over time, but ultimately you kind of have to hang on to that. And then the other thing is what we were talking about before, kind of it's about all of us doing our small part. So I think there's something about kind of, maybe it's something about whiteness or white feminist politics that wants the grand gesture, it wants the kind of big success. There's something kind of neoliberal about kind of wanting outcomes, wanting kind of massive policy change or something. And actually it's not about that. It's about kind of putting one foot in front of the other and trying to sort of make the difference that you can within the situation that you have. And there's two things that I would say about that. The first thing is try everything, which is another thing that Mariam says. You know, this is a kind of experimental project in a way, isn't it? We have to try things. If they don't work, we try something else. You know, if we fail, which will be most of the time, we have to learn to fail better. And the second thing is something about timescales. You know, this is not all going to be sorted out in 10 years even, you know, and I think maybe some of us as white feminists imagine we're going to get a new law through, or we're going to get a new kind of social program or something, and then we're going to get an OBE, and then we're going to be written about in the history books. And that's not how it happens. It takes a long time. You know, I mean, capitalism took hundreds of years to evolve. You know, it's going to take that much time potentially to dismantle it. So in my head, I'm working on a timeline of hundreds of years, and I'm kind of thinking, if I can do something by the end of my life that I feel has had a positive impact in some small way, then I'll feel like I haven't been wasting my time. So I think we need to get away as well from these delusions of grandeur, and the kind of neoliberal demand for kind of rapid projects with really big impacts, because that's not how it happens most of the time. Not unless you go and burn down the government. I mean, that's another option, sure. You know,
an option for sure.
Definitely, you know, and we can certainly try doing things like that.
I just wanted to pick up quickly, because this is such a positive framing, everything you just said. I'm really glad that we've ended on hope as a discipline and everything good. But yeah, we gave a paper yesterday, and part of that was about the erotic, right? It's my favorite essay of all time. I make no means about that, it's great. But I feel like what you've just said kind of ties in with that. So this idea that we don't have to deny ourselves the opportunity of seeing people not as inherently bad. We can actually, because I think that's quite hard, you know, speaking as someone that, you know, when you dealt with abuse in the past or different forms of harm, and sometimes like I feel that I disallow myself the chance of actually repairing, because I think it's sometimes better or easier to not engage with obviously how fraught that conflict is. But it can be more fulfilling, right? So it can be the antithesis of, you know, this anti-erotic situation if we embrace that a little bit more. I really found that hopeful, so thank you.
And I understand that, and I think that's about collectivity as well, because we will all get to points when our individual personal trauma is affecting us so much that we don't believe anybody's any good, and we want somebody thrown in prison, and you know, and all the rest of it. And that's when we need to step back a little bit and let other people take over while we kind of heal ourselves, and while we just look after ourselves. So I think that's the other thing. It's about the collective, not just the individual survivor against the world.
I agree. We were just linking on what you were saying before about the kind of, not really the steps, because you can't really impose steps on people or localized communities or anyone, can you? But kind of the messages that you take most deeply from the work. We talked about the erotic just now, but I also think, so Fab and I, we co-write a lot together, because it's just an enjoyable process, and obviously the institution doesn't really want you to work collaboratively, so it's quite nice to sort of resist frameworks. So we used a part of a section of your book recently about we didn't end up finishing it actually, but we were writing about COVID and music making and the Kill the Bill stuff, actually. This legislation that's obviously coming in, and it's going to sort of govern, or actually it's not going to govern, it's going to prevent our ability to make sound, which is really important. But in the blog we talked about this idea that you've just talked about, the relationship between expendability and also being crucial to the system, and how in COVID we've seen that magnified. So how, you know, marginalized groups, I'm thinking of her name's, I've completely forgotten her name, the woman who was working for the British transport, like in the train station, who was
I know
Belly Majenga, in the course of her employment, and that kind of the process since for justice and accountability in that case, because there's been several layers of kind of denial of responsibility, and you know, people kind of, it's this idea of, you were talking about the outrage economy of this trying to blemish control rather than engage with obviously the harm that's occurred. yeah, for me, it's really interesting that you talk about this expendability, but also being crucial to the system at the same time. It's mind-blowing, but also, it's not,
Yeah, and I think the way it can happen is because, I mean, these more marginalized groups are crucial to the system, but not as individuals, as a kind of undifferentiated mass of disposable labor. So the system would not be able to run without the labor of Belly Majinga and people like her, without the labor of the immigrant workers, historically without the labor of the slaves on whose backs capitalism itself was built. But as individuals, they don't matter. As individuals, they are, disposable and interchangeable. And I think we all are at some level, but obviously some groups are much more disposable than others. Yet at the same time necessary, and and the whole kind of clap for carers stuff, while they're not being given adequate PPE, was such a kind of clear representation of that, wasn't it? And the thing is that mainstream feminism also treats these groups as disposable. The outside of the system is also the outside or the margin of mainstream feminism. What Akil Bembe might call the necropolis, or Gargi Bhattacharya in her book about racial capitalism, which I really recommend reading, talks about the kind of the outside of capitalism, the sort of the zone, the no-go area, in which more and more people are being placed actually as capitalism develops and develops, and that kind of outside that zone is present in mainstream feminism as its constitutive other and as its kind of zone of disposability on the back of which we make our gains. In all kinds of ways, not just sexual violence politics that relies on the carceral system, but these care chains, through which women like me are having our houses cleaned or our kids looked after by women who are then having their kids looked after by women, who have left their kids at home in order to come here and send money home, and then somebody else looks after them, and, it kind of goes down the chain. So, I think we really, and we'd rather not think about that. We'd rather, we'd much rather focus on just kind of making these gains that we want to make for ourselves. But I think it's time we really, well, it's past time we reckoned with some of that.
Yeah.
Oh, this is so true.
Well, the one thing I think we should wrap up on is this, you touched on before, making small steps and kind of knowing your role. And I think I'm a big fan of podcasts. So when you sounded that podcast klaxon earlier on, I was so happy because no one I know really likes podcasts. So I think it's Prentice Hemhill has a really good podcast called Finding Our Way. And it's about asking questions and sort of not knowing the answers, but finding our way through sort of some of the themes we've talked about today about harm and other things. But I think Adrienne Marie Brown was on this or on her own emergent strategy podcast. I can't remember, but so she talks about in her book as well, right? But in the podcast, she talks about knowing our roles, right? We all have a role to play or several.
That's right.
The kind of deconstruction process of all these systems, and also that we, in knowing our role, that's not a bad thing. This is the thing that we can contribute, and that doesn't have to be a massive, as you said, like impact thing that is produced and then just wheeled out and then wheeled back again when the time's right. This is something that we practice in the everyday because it is a discipline. I find that really hopeful.
Yeah, I do as well. And thinking I just have to play my small part, and I just have to be, or try to be, as clear-eyed as I can be about what I want to achieve, in the world and what I want to change. And then, and we have to just reflect kind of all the time on whether we might be doing more harm than good, as well. I mean, I've had a project for a number of years now called Changing University Cultures, which is doing equality and diversity work in institutions. And we recently had our kind of 5-year reflection. And I think we have concluded actually that we've probably done more harm than good in a lot of ways, because we've been co-opted, we've been weaponized, we've become non-performative, we've been used to polish up the institution, all that kind of stuff. So then you change your approach, then you kind of think, right, we need a different strategy. And it's it's kind of getting away from this idea that we have to do something really big and grand and successful, and kind of really getting it down to these small steps. I mean, collecting for your local food bank is, you know, one amazing thing that you can do, which is a relatively small thing, but it's you know, it's hugely important. And I think within universities, I would like to see more kind of maybe smaller units, departments or research groups or whatever, having these types of conversations about how do we build trust with each other, so that when bad behavior happens, we can talk about it. And so we can talk about that in a way that doesn't escalate things and actually helps us all to become closer as a unit, because some of the behaviors that happen in universities are kind of really quite extreme, and some of it's to do with the way that the system builds power for certain individuals, but some of it is just about, you know, people who are doing things that are problematic and who aren't being kind of approached about it, and who aren't being given an opportunity actually to hold themselves accountable. So I'd like to see more stuff like that happening as well. I mean, that's where my work's going in one direction of the future. We'll be going towards kind of thinking about transformative justice in universities, and thinking even kind of the step before that, which is what would we need in order to be able to even consider doing something like this in a university.
Right. Okay, so this has been great. Alison, I mean, this has been more than great, actually. This has been a really, really lovely conversation. I really appreciate you saying yes to us.
Oh no, it's been lovely. Thanks for having me so much, and you've lifted me up.
That was exactly my feeling when we were kind of having this break. I just thought, I feel really uplifted. And
no, this book is we wouldn't just say it, but it's so much depth and so much richness, and it's definitely helped my framing. I hope it helps others as well that go and buy it or find it somewhere online.
I hope so too.